afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Professor Tamara Chaplin. I am a modern European historian and chair of the George A. Miller Committee. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here on behalf of the University of Illinois Center for Advanced Study to welcome you to this live George MillerComm event. So thank you so much for joining us. And let me invite anyone who's sitting back up there to actually move down. You know, we'd love to have you closer if you feel so inclined. This afternoon, we have the composer, performer, interdisciplinary artist, and educator, David Rosenboom, whom the New York Times has lauded as an avatar of experimental music with us. And he's coming to us from the California Institute of the Arts to speak about his pioneering work on propositional music in order to discuss, among many other things, how music interacts with the human brain. So we're delighted that David Rosenboom's talk will be followed by a panel discussion with UIUC alumna and the electroacoustic experimental composer and co-founder of the Symbolic Sound Corporation, Carla Scaletti, with UIUC's Thomas M. Siebel Chair in the History of Science and my colleague, David Sepkoski, and with UIUC's Condensed Matter Physics Professor, Smitha Vishveshwara. My apologies, I'm just killing people's names. But first, let me acknowledge that our institution is on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Waiaw, Miami, Muscooten, Ottawa, Sauk, Muskogee, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territories of these nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. So as a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that enabled the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. So I invite us to just reflect on and address these histories and the role that the university has played in shaping them. And this acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward. And second, it is my honor to tell you a little bit about George A. Miller, who, along with our vast range of co-sponsors, makes these events possible. So George Miller received his PhD in 1893 and taught at Michigan, Cornell, and Stanford before coming to Illinois. He's the author of more than 20 publications and was well known for his work on the theory of finite groups. He was president of the Mathematical Association of America, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He was quiet, unassuming, devoted to this university and to the field of mathematics. And no one guessed that this unassuming gentleman was a world-recognized mathematician, nor that he had more than meager savings. But when he died in 1951, he left an estate of almost $1 million to the University of Illinois, stating, "Everything I have received from the university, and I simply want to repay my obligation." And we are so very, very grateful for his generosity. So the hallmark of a CAS MillerComm event is its broad appeal across the disciplines, and this is clearly demonstrated today by the range of supporting events and units who have made this afternoon's event possible. So I'd like to thank the Carl Arwosy Institute for Genomic Biology, the Art-Science program, the Department of History, the Department of Chemistry, the Department of Computer Science, the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, Humanities Research Institute, the Office of the Chancellor, the Robert E. Brown Center for World Music, the Sousa Archives and Center for American Music, Symbolic Sound Corporation, and the Neuroscience program. And special thanks to the School of Music for hosting David's visit to our campus. And now, it is my special pleasure to hand over the mic to my current student in the Department of History, Anastasia Chernysheva, a young historian of experimental electronic music who initiated our guest visit to our campus and who will be introducing David Rosenboom to us today. Anastasia, please.
Hi everyone. So, okay, tomorrow review the before putting labels on other people, I should probably do a favor to myself. I would say more generically historian of art, science, and technology, probably not far from truth. The series of 11 events bringing together arts and sciences is seemingly my creation, the work on which lasted for almost 8 months and wouldn't be possible without support of many mentioned departments and particular people contributing to the event series. I would like to use this moment to express special gratitude to Jason Finkelman, who helped me through this whole period and who is not with us today. And without further ado, I'm very excited to present another human who filled me with optimism through the whole period of preparation. David Rosenblum came to UIC in 1965, back when dinosaurs roamed on Earth. So he's truly historical. And then later in the 60s, they proceeded in various other institutions, particularly in University of Buffalo, NYU, University of Toronto, and many others. In late 70s, he got back to US, and since then, he has been in the heart of experimental, musical, and other creative activity on the West Coast. First as a faculty of Mills College, and then running School of Music at Carla for 30 years. Restless person. Music in its pure form was never enough for him. In 1970, he began using brainwave signals for live performance with electronics. And it's only one direction of his practice of converging arts, sciences, and technologies to explore new dimensions of human creativity. So, I guess I should give the floor to him, by the way. Thank you for being with us, J. Miller, Professor. David Rosenblum, please join me welcoming him.
Thank you so much for all the wonderful words of introduction and for being invited here today, excuse me, as a George A. Miller Professor. Actually, it's my second time in that role. I came in 1995 for also a residency, although this one is much broader in scope and involves many more people, and I'm thrilled to be here to do it. So I'm going to talk for a while and show you a whole bunch of slides and ideas and things to stimulate imagination and tell you a bit about the history of the work that I do and lead us into some, I hope, stimulating questions about music in particular and the sciences, but the arts and sciences together and ways in which they can meet in deep theoretical territory. So let's get going because I have a lot to show you. So first, just to give you a little background about what I mean when I talk about propositional music. Now, when I was here in the 60s, and I worked, probably the person I worked with the most was Salvatore Martirano, who will be honored tomorrow in an event as part of this series. And we were talking about, at that time, sort of the pedagogy of composition. The traditional pedagogy of composition was something called model composition, which is basically somebody says to you, your teacher says to you, bring me 20 bars next week in the style of Bartok, or something like that. It also led to another way of looking at model building, particularly in the early algorithmic composition work of Leger and Hiller and others, with the idea that one could build models of something and then activate those models to generate compositions or some sort of compositional interaction, maybe. And that resonated with me quite a bit, and I started working with that idea. And slowly over the years, I began, also because I had a very strong interest in fields like, I developed a very strong interest in neuroscience and music, and had been very much involved in some of the early computer work and early development of electronic music and so on, that it led me to the idea that an approach to composition, which I then started calling propositional music, really took that point of view that we can make art. We have the license as artists to do things that are pretty free, and we can make a lot of what-if questions about things without having to without having to prove that our what-if is actually the way of the universe, but we can try something out. And we can go from those what-ifs to building sort of propositional models of things like ideas about evolution, or ideas about consciousness, or ideas about various things that you see here, sort of, and then we make dynamical embodiments of them. Now that often leads to interactive work, work that engages audience, which I will call interactees, with things that break down the sort of performer-composer divide, and also even audience-composer separation, what the theater people call the fourth wall. So this is sort of my perspective on it, and I'll show you some examples of what I mean. But first, something a little bit fun. That's me in 1965, working with my wonderful instructors. That's Sulima Stravinsky, one of the world's incredible pianists, also a composer, and Gordon Binkert, who was my first composition teacher in my first semester in 1965. My second semester, I insisted on working with Sal Martirano, and then things took off from there. And then here we are today. So what's new? Well, the time that I was here was a time of incredible creative explosion. It was a time in which things were active here that were interacting with music. There was the Biological Computer Laboratory, Heinz von Forster, and various other people working in cybernetics. The Experimental Music Studio, the first one that Hiller started, was being built. Cybernetics, artificial intelligence, the early versions of artificial intelligence, not necessarily what we call it today. Linguistic systems theory, information theory, algorithmic composition, and what we called intelligent instruments, meaning instruments that had some degree of adaptability, were exploding. And that was an incredibly exciting time. And so things happened. There were things like, Martirano used to live in something called the Roundhouse, where amazing concerts happened of experimental music that were off campus, but it created a kind of community that was incredible. One of the classes that I was strongly influenced by was taught by Kenneth Gaburo, basically investigating systems theory. And these are assignments that were given to them. I gave a talk in that class on an early paper by Edgar Kunz and David Cranbuhl on information theory as a measure of structure in music, which led to new ideas about expectation, about how we listen and how we anticipate what we are going to hear. And then some of my students got rebellious one year, and we put on our own little festival, kind of in reaction to one of the contemporary arts festivals that was going on at Illinois at the time, and we put it on in the student union, and it was called the Black Bag. And well, okay, so this was 1967. You can see the sort of nature of the graphics. Gaburo's class led actually to, oops, I went too far. Gaburo's class actually stuck with me, and he was a lifelong friend until he passed away also. And he gave a talk once in one of the classes called Extraction, in which he really was opening the door to investigating what is the nature of form. What is form in music or in anything? How do we perceive it? How much of it is something that we extract, and how much of it is something that's actually in the experience or in the object that's being looked at and given a description of what its form is. So this is a wonderful book I recommend, actually stimulated by some of the work of Philip Agre. Some people in artificial intelligence might know that name. He was an early critic of early directions of artificial intelligence, about composition as critical technical practice. And this is a chapter that I wrote for it called Illusions of Form, which investigates, again, harking back to that class I took with Ken Gaburo, about what do we mean when we talk about form, especially in the arts. What is form? So these are some of the directions. Here's a score for a piece. Whoops, I keep going the wrong direction. There we go. This is a score for a piece I wrote here in 1966 that actually was an example of model building in which I took an approach to the nature of time and dealt with the length of the piece as if it was a waveform. And that waveform, that piece was 12 minutes long. So imagine a sine wave that's 12 minutes long. And then you begin to divide it up according to various ways of dissecting its harmonic series and various other things. And various structural things happen in the piece that are aligned with the ways in which you carve up what those relationships are, all the way up to, from 12 minutes, all the way up to the duration of tones and tones themselves and on. And I even fantasize going into the nature of light as a means of doing it. And this was my sketch at that time of the model of how the piece worked, the 12 minutes being here, and these are all some of the big structural important points that happen that are based all on having something that's like a 12-minute long sine wave. And the score also it took apart music notation in a way that made a scale of degrees of freedom in the notation, starting with traditional notation and then systematically stripping away specificities, things that are determined or specified in a fixed way, and making a scale of relationships. So there was a scale of 7 kinds of notation, ranging from fixed in traditional style to very open forms. And it was wild, and it sounded a little like this. Just to give you a little feel, it was premiered in Smith Hall in 1966. It's lately been re-recorded. So some of the things, again, propositional music for me, collapsing distinctions among formal processes, really pulling back and saying, okay, we have license to look at why we make distinctions between things in a formal process and question them, and then make decisions on our own compositionally about how we're going to decide how 2 things are different or the same, and how they might or might not be related, and then making scales of relatedness. I've had a fascination with self-organization and emergent forms. Dynamic dimensionality is that gets pretty deep, but it has to do with the emergence of dimensions of description that come with making distinctions, which in what might be start out as like a field without differentiations in them. These are all actually processes we use in composition now. Musical configuration spaces, that's inspired by what a configuration space is in physics, is the way I understood it, because it lays out the possible ways in which all the relationships on a musical page might collapse into a realization in a particular performance. And I'll show you some examples. And so those are the kinds of things that go in there. This is also interested in how we can apply this in a useful, in a musical form that might be activated in cultural relationships as well, because I've been very interested in cross-cultural things. So I ask the question, what happens when we might have 2 forms of musical intelligence that that may be emerging, or intelligence, whatever that is, are trying to communicate with each other, but the communication has to be created in a co-creative way. How can that create itself. I was looking at ways that might happen in time and how rather than try, let's say we were trying to communicate with an extraterrestrial intelligence, let's say, we would have to deal with time relationships, but how effective would it be if we actually sent a message that we expect the receivers on the other hand to understand, that requires a kind of concurrence of imagination, which we don't have any way of predicting, nor do we have any way to really understand what the breadth of ways in which something that we might attach the word intelligence to would happen. So this is an image of things reflecting back and forth. And as they reflect, they create overlaps, and you have summation of experience that might be created. An example of that I tried at, there was something called the World Culture Forum that took place, that happens once in a while in some city in the world. This one was in Denpasar in Bali, and it was a huge gathering of cultural leaders and political leaders from many countries around the world. The least present was the US, unfortunately. But I was there, and I had the great opportunity of working with an Indonesian colleague of mine named Sardono Kusumo, incredible artist, to produce the opening spectacle. We had the opportunity to work with 600 dancers and musicians, and we were going to organize them in some way in an outdoor cultural park in what used to be a limestone quarry, and create something. So we hit on the idea of using swarming algorithms, murmuration, where you can create how can you parse, what's the most parsimonious, or what do you say, the most efficient way to give minimal instructions to get maximal results. So things like, we're going to move in this direction, you have to keep this distance from anyone who's near you. So when one person moves in, the whole thing moves this way or that way, and it moves around. So we had this whole group moving. And these were, some were professionals, some were not professionals participating in this, and the result was really incredible. You could see projected on the sides of the limestone walls, we also had computer-generated swarming behavior. So we get tremendous results with very little so on. So investigating time, there's been a lot of work going on lately to try to figure out what time is, and equally in music. And I've developed an idea that I refer to as multiple independent nows. And this was, we don't have time to go through all of this, but it was kind of a little meditation exercise in imagining how do we take the present apart and synthesize a past for this present and project a future for this present, and deal with it as a single entity. And over there may be another one happening in a different way. So I began to imagine time as very granular in this respect. So this is all published, but how can we sort of look at the way we cognize something as complex as time? And this is partly related to the Art-Science Convergence, that in order to really understand things in a certain way, we sometimes have to change the way we describe something. And then that changes the brain, and suddenly we think or imagine something in a different way. So here's an example of the way I was thinking about the fine structure of what I call the temporal present. I'm thinking about this in music, but I also am thinking about how can this apply to other fields as well and other ways of understanding things. So, and then this is a little drawing of just sort of imagining these nows, pasts, and futures pulling apart in a sort of a granular space and becoming something that we can share, or we have these multiple independent nows somehow existing in some granular space. So just to give myself a little a plug for my latest album, which is called Nows, and it came from a collaboration with a wonderful composer, trumpeter, electronic musician, Sarah Bell Reed, who was before, at one time my doctoral student. And we decided we were going to do a collaboration. We worked together quite a lot. And then the pandemic hit, and we couldn't do it in the way we would go into a recording studio. So we decided that we were going to find a way to exchange sound ideas with each other without talking, but just with exchanging sound. And we would react to each other's sound, we would add to it, we would make something new, and this went on for some months. And then it got to be really good, and we decided we got to release an album of this, and so we did. And here's just the opening track. It's pretty hot, and the tracks have quite different feelings. Some of them are, I'm going to show some of them in greater detail in some of the seminars and classes I'm going to visit through the week, but they have soundscapes of all sorts of different kinds. And so this just got released about 3 weeks ago. Okay. We also, in exploring time, I started working even into the 70s, and then a little bit in the 80s, and then very intensively in the very early 90s of what we call of teleconcerts. My colleague Morton Subotnick and I developed a series where we were connecting musicians from around the world with technology that we could build, not using the internet, but using digital telephone lines that we could get AT&T to give us. In fact, they give us, AT&T Foundation helped fund it. They don't exist anymore. But connecting places where we would have musicians figuring out how to play together. And they, that went on for quite some time. And we did quite a few things quite successfully. It turns out with the internet, you can do it, but you have unpredictable time latency issues, whereas with these digital telephone lines, the delay, there's this annoying thing called the speed of light that keeps us from being instantaneously connected. But between Los Angeles and New York, it's about 1/3 of a second. And so we would build that into composition. So I built that into a piece. Here's an example. Sorry, I have to wait through the credits. So we're trying to open things up. So we had these 3 places connected, and I'll just show you a little bit of the introduction. And
now we're going to go to the third work, which is a composition by David Rosenboom, and played by David Rosenboom on this piano from Santa Monica, and J.B. Floyd playing on this piano from New York, being heard on that piano in Santa Monica. I think that's the way it goes. What's happening here is the piano sends out, where am I being seen? Over there it is. The piano sends out MIDI computer signals, MIDI signals, which is again going through the line, going to Santa Monica, being picked up by a piano like this and played as I was doing remotely with the sensors, and vice versa from David coming in this way. You will have the program notes, so you'll be able to read further about it. How are we doing with the lines?
saw the old Mac there running all of this stuff. So we kept doing that for a while, and now, during the pandemic, of course, we've developed all sorts of ways of doing things, networking things across the world. I want to throw this out. This is an idea that I've been working with for a while, not yet having realized a project with it, but I have, and I'll back up after this and show you more of the brain work that led to this, but I am very interested in this idea of current complexity. So here's what I mean by that. Let's talk about it with respect to the brain. There is some preliminary evidence done by work done by others that has shown that if one uses a complexity measure, now what is complexity? That's a big question, and in this case, it's done through a multidimensional measures where you measure a time signal and you determine how many dimensions do you need in order to describe the signal. And the more you need, the more random it is. And the fewer you need, the less it is. But that's what was used in these early studies. But there was some evidence that one could see with someone whose EEG is being monitored and music is being played, and you measure the complexity of the auditory signal and you measure the complexity of the brain signal, that there's some evidence that they can be seen to move in parallel. And that started my interest in it, but it mushroomed into a bigger idea, of course. And now, looking at the complexity of our environment, how might we look at this? This is where another sort of this is a little earlier idea, but sort of where it might sort of come from is viewing the idea of a musician's or creative sound person's relationship to what you might call an instrument could be thought of as a particular state connecting two complex networks. And when you think about it that way, we can start to recognize those states, those individual states, as compositional units, almost the way you would think about a note. So as that changes, you can compose that way. So that's one of the early ideas about it. And this is just a thinking sketch I made recently in which, just looking at this, how could we measure, what is the complexity of our multimodal environment? And can we somehow measure that? And can we then look at measuring, this is my cute way of saying pi, perceiving, interacting entity. Let's call it a human, maybe, or could be something else. Dimensional complexity measure is what I referred to. There's another one called multiscale entropy, and there's other ways too of measuring what that means. And then, is it possible to develop a feedback system here where a kind of emerging meta-agent might develop, and can we use that, can we make a kind of a framework for creative work out of that? And as you think about it more, you begin to think about our environment, you begin to think about our internet-based environment, and and it can really extend itself into very interesting territory. So I'm throwing it out, not having made a project with it yet, but it's something I want to work on. I'm going to talk with some of the people from neuroscience while I'm here, and might get into it a little bit when we talk with molecular biology. There might be some interesting discussions, and it relates to some of the stuff that I will play next. So we know a few things. There's that the perception of complexity is also related to an observer's context. So, for example, if you're listening to a drone made by the great composer Lamont Young, it might seem like there's not much happening, But as soon as you turn up the microscope on that drone, you find that very small variations suddenly become very complex. That's a very important thing to take into account. There tends to be a kind of power law scaling that relates to the various levels of how you're either backed away from or you're dialed into more microscopic changes. Just as a watch this little video and just think if this were going very, very slowly, how you might perceive when something changes and when it might not be changing. These are simply textures photographed from nature. How does one change into another, and what do we perceive as the complexity of what we're seeing, and how does that change? Just an experiment. Related to that is, I mentioned the drone idea. So I did an experiment. I have a composition called Two Lines, in which I took the notion of the idea of the drone. In this case, it was one that I played on a viola. Trying to play a double stop as stable as I could for as long as I could. I used to play with Lamont Young's ensemble, and boy, one learns bow control when you have to make something not move for a very long time. It's really hard. So I did that, and then I decided to look closely into it, and I did a pitch tracking process with a computer and tried to then magnified the variations really greatly to look at how they change. And then I mapped those into pitch space. So if there's a tiny change of this much, it'll produce a note up here. If there's a little bit bigger note or change, it'll produce one way up here. And then I scored that and made a piece called Two Lines, which I recorded with my good friend and colleague Anthony Braxton, great composer, performer. And it's out on a CD, and here's what the score ended up looking like. So this starts with a drone, and you can see these notes are jumping around and jumping around and jumping around. So this is an example of that zooming in on what you try to make as a very stable experience. This is a very crude but interesting mapping of, I call it a phase portrait of the pitch changes, where you're relating a current pitch to the preceding pitch and the preceding pitch. And it produced a pattern that looked like there was a kind of a tractor around this particular space. And I conclude just intuitively that it has to do with the physiology of playing something and perceiving a deviation and then trying to correct for that deviation and then bringing it back and then going a little too far and going like this. And so you're circling around what you're trying to achieve. So it has this angularity to it. And I listened to this for a long time and I thought, what's making this so interesting to me? It's not, and my brain could tell me it's not random. The brain is amazing how the integrative powers of perception are really incredible. I remember in the very early days of in my case, mini computers, where you had 16 lights flashing for each of the digital registers going by, and you're trying to debug a program, and you just stare at them, and then all of a sudden you can see a loop, and you can see it, whereas you couldn't find it before, and that leads you to finding out where the bug was. Okay, musical configuration spaces. Tell you what those are like. There's one. This is a score that I made when I was at the Center for Creative and Performing Arts at the State University of New York at Buffalo. And this is a score in which I made a symbol library, for which there's a dictionary applied to every instrument that might play this. And it's a space in which there are various parameters of sound that I've turned into notation. In this case, I'm trying to work with just raw sound, not notes or anything from the tradition, but just raw sound. And in each of these closed figures represents what I would call, you could call it a phrase. So at each vertex, there's a symbol that tells you how to start or stop a tone. And then along the lines, it tells you how the tone should evolve, how it changes. And there's a whole instruction book that goes with this, which makes it impractical because musicians have to read the instruction book and learn everything. But nevertheless, it's had some interesting results. And the various parameters various parameters of sound are mapped along several rotating axes. And the one that's most obviously visible is density. Obviously, the right side is more dense than the left side. But there are other things hidden. Then to make it work, there's a rotating plastic overlay that ensembles can use to decide how they're going to organize a section or a movement. So they could say, we're going to go all the way around, and we're going to give 20 seconds to each box, and we're going to play whichever figure is shown part of the figure inside the box. Then we're going to stop, and then we're going to make one cloverleaf loop, and we're going to give a minute to each box, and then we're going to play that. So that's it. It's left up to the musicians. It's a big, there's the score with an ensemble by the late Bill Duckworth, who was actually a classmate when I was here in the 60s. It was written about in this book called This Life of Sounds, which is about documents the whole Center for Contemporary Creative and Performing Arts at Buffalo, which was a big deal at that time in the late 60s. And since then, I've tried to imagine what if we were to be able to create a notation space that was three-dimensional, and where are the musicians inside this rotating ball? How might this be turned into sound? Here's a picture of the individual units. Here's another one. This is a piece written for solo or multiple trumpets. It's a configuration space in my mind because I have created here each item that is surrounded by a dark bar line is considered a musical unit. But I've made a kind of counterpoint system out of a system of modal transformation that maintains its identity no matter the order in which you play these. So you can play any one, then you can go to any other, and you can have even an ensemble do this, but the piece will always have its particular identity. So it, in my mind, collapses into a particular realization when the performers decide how they're going to go through it. There's another page from the same thing where things are laid out differently, but there's a different kind of material. Here's a score for piano, in which the pianist can enter any one of these, and then they come out, and then they can go back and enter another one and another one. Now switching, this is my most recent instrumental piece, which is a string quartet, it's a single movement string quartet that I wrote for a group in Los Angeles called the Asura String Quartet. And it has an odd, well, it's a model, and I want to show it especially because it's recent. Here we have, it's called the Quartet for the Beginning of a Time. People might recognize a potential reference to Olivier Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time. This one is about a time ending and a new time beginning, like a universe collapsing and a new universe emerging, metaphorically. And I still haven't been able to quite accept expansion as a concept, so that's something that could be a fun discussion. In any case, the way I decided to model it, what I chose to model it with was a figure which is called a catenary. A catenary is like if you take a string and you hold it up like this and it falls down and goes up like that. It's the upside down version of the St. Louis Arch, which is a catenary. But turning them on their side. So this is a whole series of catenaries that are laying like this, and I use them to map the collapsing of one time and the beginning of another. And various musical parameters are mapped by these various colored lines. And the way they are, the way they actually work is that the wider the catenary, it says here diffusion of parameter. What that means is the wider the catenary, the less clear it is. So it's smeared a bit, and then as it narrows in, it becomes more and more focused on a singularity, single musical idea. And then we have, I call it an event horizon here. It's an omega point. It's the golden section of the whole time frame. And then we have this thing emerging. So it's just another example of a model. Here's a few pages of the score. It starts out and moving from something that's rather tonal to something that's rather complex, and something that becomes another almost configuration space because the notation opens up. And the musicians, when they get to this page, are able not just to move this way, but up and down as well as they go through the particular time frame. Here's a little example. So that's another one. This one I want to throw into that there was an opportunity, had a wonderful opportunity to fund an idea about an interactive opera that was done in 2008, 2009, called Ah. Just a single word. It's actually inspired by the Diamond Sutra, the Buddhist Diamond Sutra, in which there is, I had the opportunity to fund a group of very young composer performers to come to California for 2 summers on a workshop to develop something in a collaborative way that had something to say about the world today. And I collaborated with a writer this was part of the idea of it, to create a very unusual interactive thing. The funding came from something called the, forgotten what it's called. Anyway, the project was called The Counterpoint of Tolerance. The students all worked with myself and the writer for these 2 summers, and then we worked interactively over the course of the following year, and then got back together again. But the idea here is that we have now, I wouldn't know if I'd call this a configuration space, but it's a non-linear narrative. So I'm very interested in the idea of how do you take these ideas into actual narrative or into dramatic structure or what have you. And this turned out to be, the way we did it was there are 13 short stories written that are all inspired by not a setting of, but kind of inspired by the Diamond Sutra, because we thought, well, if we're going to say something about the world today, the thing to tackle is the nature of illusion. And so that's what the inspiration was. So these are all little stories set in modern time, but they're linked in there's a linking line between the various stories as they're laid out in this kind of mandala. So if you're reading this one, called The Origin of Conflict, if you come to this line, now he is aware that he can be perceived in countless ways, you can continue in this story, or you can move to the story of being invisible, in which the narrative would continue. And so you can see there are a vast number of ways to go through this. And so again, it creates its own form if you make a once-in-time theatrical version of it. You can also leave it to be in another kind of interactive space where the narrative happens. And we considered the piece happened with a kind of activity along this Gaussian shape, that we opened it up as an online event first, and it was open to audience members to participate. Then it was an installation with interactive components, and then a performance in a theater for several performances, and then back out again. And it stayed active online for several years. The people were interacting with it. And then we had installations, like it was mapped out on a big multi-touch table, like a giant iPhone, where people could put their hands and move the text around and the sound. That's another workspace. And then the performance.
When shopping at the bodega, she views cans with labels, and though she's aware of her preferences, she stays mindful of the fact that a label should not be imputed as the reality of the thing itself. Sitting before towers of labels in the dimly lit mini-mart, she is instantaneously transported to a group of tourists and school children roaming the Duomo in Milano.
So, back to 1969. Why? Because, now I'm going to go in another direction.
David will attempt to control a particular brainwave called alpha, which covers only 8 to 12 cycles per second.
After some considerable training, you can hear a great increase in the duration of tone, and you can see that the record shows a great deal of very rhythmic, regular activity. The alpha activity is about all that's present on the record at this point.
So that was the laboratory of Lester Femi at State University of New York in Stony Brook. And he was one of the early researchers in brain biofeedback. And I was led on a tip from a close colleague of mine that to say, I should go out there and find out what's going on. And so I did and found it to be very engaging. I felt like I got pretty good at it pretty quickly, and that changed a lot for me. It changed the direction of some of my work, and it started to move more into what I would call neuromusic, or music and neuroscience in some way. That has now become a huge field, as some of you may know. It inspired me to find these relationships between what we could know about brain function and what we know about aesthetic experience, what I'll call aesthetic experiences. You could define that in various ways, but and in a whole bunch of ways. I'm going to just run down a few and then end with a most recent. Talk about the most recent. There was an event I put on at a place called Automation House in New York in 1970, which I called Ecology of the Skin. It was a both performance and interactive installation where people could come in, and I had figured out a way to make actually EEG sensors, actually make them because they're so expensive to buy in those days, and developed this installation, which led to a whole lot of speculation about ways that this could develop. And we were even at that time, there's just some of the controls of what was going on. I was very much involved with the idea of pairs of people developing synchronous controls. And we got away with putting stuff into people. There were phosphine stimulation stations. Phosphenes being the colored patterns you can see when your eyes are closed, or you press on your eyeball, or some other chemical or other stimulus can make them happen. And we had stations where people could put really tiny current pulses on their temples, and it would cause phosphine stimulation. We got away with it. We didn't have problems with it. I'll skip over this. This is just some of the control stuff that was going on. The phosphine stations. That was a painting I made simulating the phosphine experience, which I still have. And then I gathered together in mid-70s material from people I knew at the time who were doing early work in biofeedback in the arts, and published this book. It has been very important. I was glad that I did it at the time because it helped sort of lay some sort of foundation for people who wanted to get into this. It was, and I circled a few, I'm not going to read these, but a few paragraphs from some pages that illustrate a kind of a techno-optimism of the time. We believed in the power of new technology to perhaps fix things in the world. I don't know if we fixed anything at this stage, but we're really very optimistic about all these kinds of things. Influenced by people like Buckminster Fuller, who wrote Utopia or Oblivion, or Spaceship Earth, or ways and ideas about we really could take care of everybody in the world if we just could distribute resources properly. And so there was a lot of feeling that things like this could develop. I proposed something called IRIS, Individual Resource Information System. I imagined a way that with this new technology we could monitor the sort of the health of the world by pooling data, which now we would be very scared about, but we do in some ways, and it was very important to me. One of the one of the principles that's kept with my work is what I call more than one. That is working with the idea of not so much individual biofeedback paradigms, but where there are multiples, where you look at what's going on in more than one brain at a time when they're in a certain kind of experience. There's a Springer put out this book called Brain Art recently, which is really great. It's a tremendous collection of work from a lot of different people that are in this field now, which, as I say, is huge. There are international conferences and things like in this area a lot. My colleague Tim Mullen, who's a neuroscientist, originally coming out of the Schwartz Center for Computational Neuroscience at UCSD, and I wrote a chapter here about what we call multiple contingent or multi-agent BCI, multi-agent brain control interfaces. So here's an early one. This was 1972, a piece I called Portable Golden Philosopher's Stones. There have been 3 versions of that piece done. There was an electronic music ensemble called Biome, and we did this performance at something called the International Carnival of Experimental Sound in London in 1972, which was an amazing festival. And here's a piece called, which I did for the Vancouver Art Gallery around the same time, in which this is a simulated photo, but essentially 2 people would sit on the opposite sides of a 2-way mirror, and they were lit by red and green lights. I don't have a color photo of it, that were following amplitudes of their alpha waves. And it was a simple optical phenomenon, but what tended to happen was when one person was producing strong alpha, they'd see the reflection of their face in the mirror, and the other on the other side. But if they were synchronized, it would appear that the faces would shift position, like you'd see your face on the other person's shoulders and vice versa, or they'd blend in some way. And it was pretty effective. Then this is the piece that the portable gold, how it works, therefore. And then there's some, I use a correlation function computer, an analog one actually, to try to map how stable the waves are, not just use bandpass filters to be activated when the wave is in the right frequency range, and to use that to give people different levels of control over the sound that was coming from the ensemble of 4 people. And I can't help but throw this in. This got on TV and it's gone viral. And there's now, another reason I put it in is now there's a documentary being made of the 5 shows on, if anybody remembers the Mike Douglas show, that were really amazing, that were curated by John Lennon and Yoko Ono. And they invited me to come on with them. It's actually a very important event, because it was the only time I know that there was a consistent presentation in daytime TV of the progressive ideas that came out of the 60s. This was in 1972. So here they are. Rushing through because I want to give us time for good panel discussion. But there's a new documentary. I just finished doing a bunch of filming for it of that week, and it's going to come out. So if you watch for it, it'll be coming soon. Here's the newest version of that portable gold piece, which here's how it works. This is I'll go into this in more detail, and when we do our numbers to sound thing next week. I think it's next Monday, I think it is. Yeah. And it also looks at ways to measure coincident shifts of attention among 2 people who are involved in a feedback loop with sound. that's that's my CD that has a recording of this. Sounds a little like this. Then another direction of this had to do with looking at musical structure and measuring auditory event-related potentials or evoked responses. And these are not coherent wave bursts like the alpha, delta, theta, beta waves, but they are transient waves that happen that are usually associated with a stimulus that parses something, that maps a change. And there's a monograph that Leonardo published that gives a detailed technical description of how he did it. But the basic idea is that you have, first of all, it takes some good DSP work and some template matching and things to record an evoked response because they're very tiny, microvolts. And there is work now that has increased the ability to do that without having to record many of them in a row and do signal averaging. But there's a musical, something is generating music, whatever, the math, whether it's algorithmic or however, and the computer is monitoring the music and it's looking for changes of rate of change in musical parameters that might significantly be perceived as significant by someone listening and predicts you might find an evoked response at that location. And then we measure and see if that prediction is confirmed. If it is confirmed, the algorithm causes those kinds of changes to become more frequent. If it is not, then the music wanders off in some way that you might use. I've played with stochastic ways to make it wander off or genetic algorithm ways to make it wander off. And you get this convergence and divergence into patterns and not patterns. I'm going to skip this one, but here's what an idealized auditory evoked event-related potential looks like. And this is over a period of about 700 milliseconds or so. And these various peaks have been in the literature studied very deeply to say what do they occur, what do they indicate. They map the hierarchy of information processing in the brain of auditory stimuli, leading to the creation of memory ideologues and so on. And they can occur, this is just a drawing of how they can occur in between various types of brain experience. And I made this is all from that extended musical interface in the human nervous system monograph, a kind of a sort of hypothetical behavioral phase space of monitoring the kind of dimensionality of experience from coherent waves out into evoked responses. Then it proceeds to capture sequences of sound and analyze their occurrence in patterns. So, for example, let's say you have no experience at all, and something called A happens. So the only thing you can predict is that A will reoccur, but B happens, and then C happens, and then A happens again. And at that point, you group A, B, and C together in a kind of a temporal gestalt as an entity. And then you go on and go on and go on, and if you have ABC, 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 then they get grouped into a hierarchy of A prime, I call it here, and so on and so on. So I've done, here's an example of what kind of patterning might come out of that in the system that I use. See, there's a change there, so that it jumped up and down one of those hierarchical things. So far, I've been able to get it to work on maybe 2 or 3 levels, under good conditions. A lot of events happen. There was a big exhibition of this at the Centre Pompidou in Metz. This is an article I that's easy to find. It's on the Frontiers website, where I actually try to make an assessment of what's going on when neuroscientists study music, and how it's so easy to fall into a situation where you're studying something that you believe you already know what it is, but it's not always the case. That you might, if you bring a too predetermined model of what music is, you might miss what you really need to find. Then this is the most recent, most complex piece called Ringing Minds. This one this was shown in, I had a 50-year retrospective at the Whitney in New York in 2015, and it uses four people, this time with multi-channel headsets, transmitting to a computer, a technique referred to as hyperscanning. It refers in this case to treating the four brains as if they're one big brain, and then spatially averaged event-related potentials. That means across four people instead of in time. And it looks like this. So you've got an end-brain group, and we use a technique called principal oscillation pattern detection, which actually grows out of research in epilepsy, trying to discover the emergence of very, very small resonances that can get out of control and lead to seizures. But it was really effective in detecting resonant patterns that were emerging among the four brain group, and I mapped that onto a computer music program that's basically a bank of resonators. You think of them as electronic bells that have various parameters. Here's a little clip from a performance. And the resonances are also mapped onto projection. So the x-axis across has to do with where the resonance is coming from across the four brains. The vertical has to do with frequencies, and the colors have to do with things like stability. Those are evoked responses being mapped, just played on a piano. And then what we do is we then play with them after they get going for a while in the brain. Then when you're playing with them, of course, you're adding to the sound that they're interacting with, and then you see what happens, and then it becomes a band. I'm going to move past some things now because time is moving on. I want to leave time for the panel. But I do want to show you a couple of other things. This is an image of looking at a way of looking at space as distributed resonances. Some of them are stronger or weaker or group themselves on a. And I'm very interested in the uncertainties, what I call deviant resonances in instrument building, and as they apply to neural networks. Like how do we actually know what we are measuring and what we are producing? I'm going to move ahead though. I want to show you. Sorry. This is actually an interesting one. This is another model where it's a percussion piece. It's a movement of a percussion piece where the instruments are connected to a computer, and with sensors on the instruments, and the player. There's an auxiliary keyboard part, and the score is mapped out this way. This is a sketch of it, where there are functions, Laguerre polynomials, that are repeating, that determine the probability that when the player strikes a certain instrument, it'll make a change in the electronic sound. If the strike is at the top, it'll definitely happen. At the bottom, it definitely won't. And then somewhere in the middle, it might have like a 50-50 chance. And they repeat, and it's a process I call it probability rhythm. The musician actually learns these are repeating at a fixed rate. So the musician learns how this likelihood of response will create something. So it's an example of what I would call, that's the piece, of what I would call playing a model. So the model is really the instrument in this case, this propositional model. I'm going to go out of this mode and I'm going to, I always do this, I make let me get my cursor, more slides in the deck than I can get to. But I just want to show you one other, let me go to this one. And then I'll stop. So this came from an opera that took place inside 24 limousines in LA called Hopscotch, which would drive audience members around the city, and performances would take place inside the cars, and then people would get out and they'd see something at a site-specific location, and then they'd get in the car, another car, and they'd go somewhere else. But I made several pieces for this project, collaborative project, and it works with brainwaves. It takes the idea of, there's a character who is going into is becoming a mad scientist in a way, and trying to determine whether heaven and hell live inside the brain. So what happens is that people enter a car, they get 4 brainwave headbands installed on them, and a singer starts singing questions to them, and they're told not to answer, but just to think their answers. And then 3 different ways of responding to the questions have been pre-recorded by a soprano, and the brainwaves mix them as if they were, you were mixing them. That's just shows the control surface. So it goes, and the questions get more and more aggressive toward the audience. So as you go through the whole performance, it's kind of like this.
Have you ever watched the great ocean on a placid morn? Did you ask it something? Did it answer?
And then you get something like this. This is a staged version.
Does it matter?
So that's trying to connect this to sort of affective interaction in one way or another. And I'm going to end with, I wanted to show, one of my graduate students at Cal Arts, who's now doing her doctorate at Harvard, called Weluka, has been making pieces that get into this sort of complexity, looking at our environment, the complexity of our environment. Looking at the red part, she's very interested in how data becomes monetized. And this is a piece in which someone comes in, they put on a VR device and their brainwave headband, and the way in which they interact with this environment determines how they will see a sort of doppelganger figure that appears like that occasionally. And that's her setup, which we can ignore. And then finally, just to sort of circle back to the cross-cultural stuff, here's another example of taking minimal descriptions and making music with some masters from Indonesia, the US, and India. You will see the score is minimal, the musicians are maximal. I'll stop there and invite the panel. Now, we have one microphone here, so I'm going to try to say as little as possible to let you guys get going. And I think the idea is one of the ideas, we'll see what they think, is to explore the whole art-science convergence idea and to get into anything that they would like to speak about in response to the talk or anything else. And I'm really honored to have you three here. Let's turn it over to you, and I'm going to have to hand the microphone to whoever would like to start.
So
I can't sit down because I have the microphone transmitter in my pocket.
I'll take it out and put it on.
I'll put it over here. Okay. Sorry.
So something that this David said near the beginning of his talk was about this sort of a golden age of experimentation and cross-disciplinary collaboration that was occurring. And so I wanted to ask this, David, about what were the historical conditions that, or were there historical conditions that caused that to happen? And could it happen again?
I mean, I think this David would probably know better than I would, because he was around a lot of places. I like to think, I mean, for me, thinking about this talk was generative in terms of thinking about history and how history works, because of the interplay that the discussion goes through in thinking about complexity, determinism, indeterminism, etc. And so I think that, I don't know, I mean, how can I'm sure we could identify 3 or 4 pretty deterministic looking lines that intersected in ways that caused, reverberations that could neither be replicated without, Laplace's God, computer, or are, kind of purely random or stochastic or something like that. But I don't, I think obviously a lot of the groundwork was done in places like the University of Illinois with, the invention of certain technologies, which I think many people in the room here know quite a lot about. And then there was the whole cultural thing, which is where we get so much, so many lines of, again, not indeterministic, but just complicated, off-axis, right? I mean, there's a lot of the tilting of axes, I think, and I don't have a better answer than that, though.
Well, maybe
Do you?
I have a follow on for Smitha. Maybe we could talk about is it desirable? I mean, of course I think it is, but what are some reasons that these kinds of cross-disciplinary interfaces are to be desired? Is it beneficial?
Yes. That's what I think.
Yeah.
But actually, I just wanted to address this point, and after that, there were 2 thoughts that, well, many thoughts, but 2 specific ones that I wanted to ask each of you. I feel like this convergence for example, if we were talking about art, science, culture, observing what you presented, they work at many different levels. So there was one level, and you use things like proposed models of worlds, universes, evolution. So there's one part that, which I thought was really fascinating, that actually takes, for example, scientific constructs. So it could be neurological signals, and then another, later we'll talk about the event horizon, but you actually had mathematical forms, and it was very, very interesting to see the sort of taking of these, let me just say, algorithms that exist in science and then convert that into music. So it's something, I think, that you couldn't actually sit down and write a lot of it. So I find that really fascinating, and maybe one question I'll have for you all is, what is the feedback like once you create this? How does that inform music or art? That's a question. But then there's also this other thing where you had the what if, and I really want to say that science sometimes has this reputation of just being very analytic, while the creative aspect is also very prevalent. So I would say that the what if, and I think now I'm coming to the questions for you. For us, the what if drives a lot of the work. For example, let's say the Higgs boson, or black holes, or condensed matter is actually what I study. It's the way individuals, when they come together, how they form a community. So your swarming intelligence carnival was an amazing example, and you see that in water too. There's molecules, together they form waves. So for us, are there strange emergent creatures that come out of the soup? That's the what if scenario. So I feel like there's these two things. One, these algorithms feeding into art, let's say, and then there's the imagination. So this is my response, but now I'm going to throw it back your direction, anybody. But so one is the algorithms, and I'm just calling it algorithm, but it's really patterns and the mathematical constructs. So for you, what role does that play in the creation of these pieces? And then the other thing is the what if scenario, and I can ask both of you, I think, but anyway, these are the two questions.
I'm a historian, we don't do what ifs.
What was? Well, I think you touched on this, right? Maybe it was even in the first slide, about models. And one of the questions you posed to us by email was, how do scientists and artists describe phenomena?
Right.
And one thought I had was, in fact, we do have a kind of a common ground, because we both build these generative models. And I don't know if this is a true story that Feynman supposedly said, what I cannot create, I cannot understand. I don't know if that's apocryphal, but it's still good. And so I think maybe that's our common ground. We already have this common ground, and it's found inside the computer, because we're all, I think, in the humanities and in the arts and in the sciences, we build models for the what if, right? We have a hypothesis. Right. We build a model in order to be able to test test that model.
Can I tack one? I just want to tack one little tiny bit extra on that, and then I want to pass the mic to David and let him respond. But in talking about models, of course, it's really interesting in talking about modeling, designing algorithms that model properties of evolution or other kind of natural processes. But of course, those are models themselves, right? Models are only ever models, and so you can come up with an interesting acoustic experiment that's modeled on a model of a natural process, but not the natural process. I mean, we have no access, directly to the natural process. So I was wondering, like, in what sense does this then also become iterative and recursive when it's, models of models of models? Because that genuinely then does also allow for feedback. And a little question I had was whether the kind of work you were doing might have had a role in changing people's minds about how to approach AI.
Well, I have a...
Oh, right, you sure do.
I've got the... Okay, there's several things there. And keying off of what the imagination part of it in relation to the models is that for me, what makes a model that I decide I want to work with powerful, or one that I want to stick with or I want to keep using is how much it surprises me. What do I discover in it? Because I've developed my approach to music and art making and in general is to create an environment. By that I mean a container, not the trees and for discovery, and to invite audience members or participants to be active participants, not just passive receivers of a fixed object, but to invite them to experience the joy of discovery, getting in something and finding something that they wow, I never experienced that before, or didn't know, or there's some phenomenon there. So that's sort of an aesthetic approach that has been important to me. I've come up with models for things that just kind of fell flat, and okay, they go off the table, and then I start working with something else. And so that's important. I think there is an iterative, recursive process, because that's the title of that book, with my Illusions of Form chapter, is Composition as Critical Technical Process, a view of it as that. Which emphasizes the idea of models, but also the idea of self-organization and emergent forms and that kind of thing as being very much a part of it. So if you're gonna really take that on, artistically, there are many ways of getting into it. And there's a part of I skipped over because I was running too long, where I kind of make some challenges about instruments, which would be important to Carla probably, is that instruments that can produce very complex phenomena, not just and that can redesign themselves in response to the way someone is interacting with them. We've for a long time we've had the ability to program things. Instruments, let's say you have a set of stimuli, maybe it's a keyboard, maybe it's something else, maybe it's the brain, maybe it's you're detecting the movement of clouds, but what the meaning of that stimulus is in terms of its response can be completely remapped at any time. So if it's a keyboard, you can say, okay, all these notes are all these keys are designed to create certain responses, but if I hit this one, they're all redefined. Right, so we've had that for a long time, but it does change the way you think about interacting with something. My dumb joke is, I'm a pianist, right? And every time I hit the F key, I get an F. What good is that? You know what I mean? And so we need this kind of determinism in engineering when we have to make sure that we know certain things happen in a certain way. But I've been interested in reading about this an evolution out of a kind of what's called classical engineering to adaptive engineering. So if you try to design the airplane to do everything perfectly, what you're not doing is designing it to change itself as the environment changes, right, in a certain way. So that's very interesting to me in terms of how it might apply to instruments. So that's part of it.
So since you bring up instruments, I wanted to comment on that to me the holy grail of instrument design is kind of related to information theory in a way. Like you want to design an instrument that lets the performer enter the flow state, by which I mean kind of skirting on this edge between something being challenging and something being totally predictable and boring. But if, for example, if every key you press redefines the instrument, I think then you're, you have too much information and you can't practice. My friend Joel Chatterby used to say, an instrument is something you practice, which sounds like the joke about Carnegie Hall, but it actually means something. It means like you don't want something so simple, an instrument so simple, like you press one button and it plays this perfect piece completely without your further interaction. That's boring. Or you have an instrument that's random, so that you can't learn. You can't influence it. So somehow we want to be on this edge where it's like challenging enough.
Right. I just very quickly, and then I'll pass it on. I play with this term I call deviant resonances. So that actually comes out of work, the neuromusic work, where there is uncertainty about what you're measuring, right? You never can be 100% deterministic about that measurement. And so, you try to find differentiations between one threshold of measurement and another threshold of measurement. But for me, it's like squeezing a balloon. It can pop out over here, it can pop out over there, and you might not be able to predict that. But actually, it's really interesting. It's a source of real interest how those things, how those deviant resonances appear, and then I try to sort of hypothesize about that out of the neuromusical world into other circumstances. And I'm sure, measurement is not easy. Right?
It's not easy. Well,
yeah.
Okay. It's not easy, but I also wanted to feed off this randomness thing, and it's for any of you and all of you. By the way, I just wanted to say the ultimate phenomenon where observing or feedback or audience changes everything is quantum physics. I just wanted to put it out there that the observer is key, and then what happens just really changes the entire nature of what evolves next.
Right.
But I wanted to sort of pick up on what you were saying, Carla, on randomness, I think, or I saw one of you was saying something. In physical phenomena, for example, randomness plays a big role. There's noise, there's chance. I think in many physical models, you can actually pick out what's truly random and probabilistic versus there's some pattern going on. And you mentioned something like scale-free or something. So even if you look at, for example, networks, and they could be anything. They could be social networks, they could be the internet, and there are hubs and they're connected to each other. There's actually things look seemingly random, but when you actually start looking closer, you can tell complete randomness from some structure. And it's also true of proteins, the way amino acids are connected. So I was just wondering about how this randomness versus structure plays a role. And I mean, it could be in history, it could be in, Carla, the kinds of things we do, and David.
Let me just ask you a question.
Yeah.
As a physicist. Is anything really random? I mean, are there random phenomena? I mean, what do you mean? I mean, certainly I understand, that for example, the independence of the momentum and the position of an electron, etc. But I mean, what do you mean in this case when you're saying random? Because you also said probabilistic, and so what? I mean, it feels important because you're a physicist. I wouldn't have been grilling, someone else if they had used the term random, but it feels important to me.
So the random that I meant was more, the intuitive thing of something chance happening. I should say that you're asking a very, very good question because for example, in the quantum, I don't want to go off too much into that. That would be a whole other. But the kind of probabilistic scenario that you have, for example, in the quantum world, is truly random. It's what you said. There are all these universes that can actually possibly exist, and then you happen to observe one of them. It's that sort of randomness as opposed to the flipping of a coin. That is not random, meaning, of course, you say there's a chance of heads or tails, and it's 50-50, but it's not random. It's actually determined by the way you flick this and the turbulence and every microscopic thing. So it's not. So in that sense, it's not random. But I do mean a more. We're all used to this sense of, as opposed to something that I know is going to happen, a chance thing. I meet this person and it changes. I do mean random in that sense.
No, and I think it's enough to just say, indeterminacy or unpredictability or something like that, because that's what you're getting at in terms of, generative possibilities for this kind of
right. And these can be to various degrees, which you can scale and you can work with. How much predictability or non-predictability you can put into a system. It's like the pseudo-random sequence. Right, a discrete state machine can't produce true randomness, right? So, but it turned out to be, and we're going to talk about this tomorrow. The Salmar is all built out of pseudo-random sequence generators and feedback shift registers, but from the perceptual point of view, making things that are somewhat predictable, somewhat not predictable, and being able to control that range is a really interesting thing to play with,
And the brain can pick up on
That's
this.
right. Yeah.
So this is again for Smitha.
And actually before then, for you, Carla, in your practice too, that plays a role. This whole if you can comment on that.
This question will relate to that, which has to do with complexity.
Yes.
And I'm not sure whether you're talking about complex systems and emergent phenomena. Because I understand something on your profile page, you talk about confining a 3D system to a lower dimension and finding that it has unexpected behavior. And I wanted to ask you if it's a emergent behavior.
Yes, it is actually.
So when you're saying true randomness, you were asking, is there randomness? Is the universe really random? Or is it a complex system? Is it?
Okay. Yes. No, that's a great question. So, and you were talking about configurational space. Is that it? You use that term,
configuration space.
Yes, configuration space.
Yes.
So I think when you're studying physical objects, the configurational space is huge. And sometimes it doesn't even matter whether things are random or not, because how did the universe choose to be this way? And even if it weren't random, you're starting in a space that's so vast that you can't really tell, did it come from some predetermined thing or not? This thing with emergence, though, and by the way, just to connect to, it's not all that abstract. So, for example, if you're in a football stadium, the wave that you have, right? We're all individuals here, but to create that wave, there's some kind of implicit rule, like, I'm interacting with you and you're interacting, and it's all the way through, and you have to have everybody involved and sort of implicitly knowing the rules to make that thing happen. Nature does that all the time, and that's that emergent thing. So even if we don't know individually what every person's doing, when you see that beautiful thing ripple across the stadium, you know that we are acting in concert, And so particles also do that sometimes. There's things that just emerge where anybody intuitively can pick it out and say, it's something that no individual could have created. It's really because of an interconnect.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just putting that out there. I don't know if there's examples that you all have.
No, you made me think about this. Like, okay, so why are we driven to do the things that we do? Why are you driven to try to understand the universe? Why are you driven to write books and interpret, understand what happened? And why are we driven to make music and compose music and perform music? Well, I think we are following local rules, like we're individuals, and we are somehow being motivated we're driven to do these things, and we don't know why. And probably there is some global phenomenon taking place, and maybe you would call that culture. I don't know what the global phenomenon is, and I wish I could see it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we are participating. There's got to be some reason we're driven to do these things. Yeah. So I think we're participating in some kind of global emergent phenomenon that we may not even be able to comprehend. Like it may be something, the complexity of which exceeds the complexity of our brains in mathematics. But
Let the audience have crack at.
We could.
I think we're meant to leave a few minutes for questions. No. I mean, I'm David should respond to that. I just noticed though that we're.
Well, for me, I've explored all these different disciplines, and I landed at a point where I was able to use music as the sort of platform from which to reach out to different phenomenon and different areas of understanding and knowledge, and actually bring it in. So it works. You know, I mean, I can apply it in a certain way. And so for me, it's I'm obsessively exploring these things, and I'm fascinated by the stuff that we really have a hard time cognizing. You know, how do we, you know, how can you put the idea of a field in your brain, right? You can mathematically you can describe it, but how can you put it in the field? We had an exchange where I was reading an article about recent research in understanding the proton, and the writer just used the phrase, the proton is a region of space. Well, 3 words just sort of flipped my brain upside down, and I saw, aha, you know, here's another way of looking at it. We exchanged email about that idea. So that's a small, maybe it's a small one. But I've always felt like when there are things that what is it in our cognitive makeup that we have to change in order to reach some way of internalizing and understanding of something that's really elusive, right? That's fascinating to me. So I don't know, I've found the music platform for me as a way of, the what if question. What if we turned our thinking upside down and thought of it this way? What is it, and then how do we come to ways of describing things that don't distort the thing, which is very tricky.
I mean, music is the space that you operate in, and technology and music and physics is the space that you operate in, and I guess human history is the space I operate in, and but I think that's a really nice way of putting it. I'm aware that we were asked to let the audience have an opportunity to ask questions, and I don't want to shortchange anybody who's patiently waited, perhaps. So I can bring the mic to somebody. Would anybody like to ask David or any of the panelists a question? We can certainly keep up.
Hello, David. Thank you for a very fascinating lecture. And I'm curious to know, in your world, if there's anything akin to Conway's game of life. And what I mean by that is sort of a simple model that many people can work on together asynchronously over time. They study it and You say, oh, cool, here's gliders, and then people study it a little bit more, and then they reach the next level of complexity, glider guns. And, it struck me that you have musical notation that lets you tell musicians what to play, but when you're trying to describe why you would play it, or what you're trying to achieve, every project has its own sort of unique grammar or visual representation or combination of words or flowcharts. And so I'm kind of curious to know, is there a simple beginner's model in the world of generative music that students can start on to say, oh, okay, this is just sort of the basic kinds of complexity that we can achieve, and your hello world is like, oh, okay, go make music for airports. And then, now that you know how to do that, then you can go on and make your own kinds of things.
So if I understand you correctly, you're asking, can we make very accessible tools or frameworks for people to try out?
You did with the keep this much space between.
Yeah, right.
And also things people can build on over time
Right.
based on each other's work, as opposed to having each project sort of be built from scratch. You have to study it on its own terms, but it's hard to then easily apply the lessons of that to other projects.
Yeah. Well, Carla brought up the swarming model that I used for the 600 musicians and so on, our dancers in Indonesia. That's a real, the set of rules that made that happen, you can write in about 6 lines, right? So it's a challenge that you pose for us who work in this field to actually make those things available and try to put them out in the world. And we probably could do better jobs of that, but that would be an example. And I'm thinking of also some things that I'm lucky to work in an educational environment, which is a very progressive, creative school. And I'm thinking of things that some of my students have done. There was another thing I had in the slide that I didn't get to was another one of my doctoral students actually developed a beautiful, almost game board-like way of navigating certain kinds of musical spaces. And his name is Hieronymo Rauschenberg. He's working on publishing. There's an article of his in Leonardo, I think, a few issues back, that describes that. So I can think of people who have made certain things like that, and are trying to make them available. No doubt we could improve on that.
I have a question relating, to the discussion of models and musicians interacting with models. I was really struck with your picture of an tractor. And a stick-slit system is a classic way to develop those attractors. And when you described that you were, drawing the bow and controlling the bow, and you ascribed some of the variation to human interaction. And I was wondering if the stick-slit system, being a bow on an instrument, and being, as a performer, very close to that stick-slit system, wasn't, very proximal interaction of a musician with the model, and then seeing the attractor result as a consequence of the composition. So I guess what I'm asking is, could it be the actual physical stick-slit system that led to that beautiful result, or do you think it was human interaction?
Excuse me. So, if I understand your question correctly, it's about the role of the human physical interaction with the system. Is that right?
Well, it's so an attractor, like pulling a tape will generate an attractor similar to what pulling a tape, an end piece of tape on a roll, will produce an attractor similar to what you're doing. Other stick-slip systems will produce an attractor that's, you know, quite similar to what you showed from your composition.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question is, could it have, if the source of that, could it have been the physical system, as opposed to, you know, of course the humans interacting with it, but the model itself that you're interacting with is the string and the bow and the rosin,
Mm-hmm.
and that physical system is so close. The actual model is represented in the stringed instrument.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Okay. Yes, I think you're right. It is that whole physical system of the person's body and ears and the physical instrument itself. What you're having to do that is being, in a sense, observed here or recorded, and then analyzed in a certain way to see. To find pattern, to find out, is there order in this? And for me, in that particular example, I did this. I made these recordings, and I mapped I greatly amplified the small variations and then mapped them in a pitch space. And I just listened to it for a while. And I just couldn't understand why was this so fascinating to listen to. You know, there was something in it that I was hearing that I couldn't understand or describe really. So I couldn't not listen to it. So I decided I would try to analyze it somehow to see if I could find out why. And so it was that method I used, that phase space thing that produced the attractors, that led me to see, wow, okay. And that chart, I think, was of the first 400 notes of the piece. I also have them for the entire piece. And the chart gets really filled in. And eventually there are kind of two orbits that show there. Why there are two? Well, I was playing a double stop. So 2 notes on 2 strings. Maybe that's something. But in any case, I could see that it was not random. You know, there was some order in it that could be observed with that particular way of analyzing it. You could probably analyze it in other ways as well to see if other things might appear. So, but yes, it's the physical system that it originates with. And then I took it one step further. I didn't really describe this. It's called 2 lines because I thought, okay, so this was, I think my slide said, bases of attraction resulting from effortful performance. So the idea is you're trying really hard to do something, and you're taking the result of that, and you're subjecting it to this kind of analysis. And so I thought, since I was at the time, I was doing a lot of playing with Anthony Braxton, my friend, and we played each other's music, and we would challenge each other as sight readers. Musicians will know. We would make complicated stuff and give it to each other and say, okay, ready, go. And we would have to play it. And there's a record actually of his quartet, and I was playing piano in it. We were going to do a European tour of jazz festivals, and the 4 musicians involved were all over different parts of the world, and we were supposed to all fly in a certain day and meet in a certain restaurant in Milan at noon. We met, and we were supposed to go into the recording studio. So Anthony came, and he gave us a bunch of sheets of paper of a piece he had just written on the airplane. And we had lunch, and then we went into the recording studio and we recorded it right away. So everybody in the band was really, really good at that. So we would kind of challenge each other. So I had this idea of saying, okay, let's take this line that I wrote, or that came out of this analysis, and let's see if the two of us can play it and try to be as together as we could. So it's another effortful thing. Try really hard to be together. And at first the idea was, okay, start at the beginning. Let's play this as fast as we can and meet at the end. And we did that. On the other hand, when we got into the recording studio to make that record, Anthony got more worried about playing the notes right. So we wanted to go slower. And we did it. But still, it's that trying something, what happens when you really analyze the result of trying something really hard?
I think with apologies to people who might still have questions, it is 7, and I think we should be mindful of the fact that David traveled quite a long time.
Oh, I'm having fun, don't you?
To get here. And you'll be here for 2 weeks, basically, of further events and opportunities for people to interact with you, which is going to be really exciting. But I really enjoyed that presentation. It gave me so much to think about.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. Thank you.